In this video, we'll be reviewing a few hands played by LLinusLLove at the final table of the 25k pound turbo event at the Triton High Roller Series in London. But before we begin the video, I should mention a few caveats. First, we will not be using ICM adjusted preflop ranges for the first 3 hands, and instead we will be using standard GTO ranges for an ante-game, which we pulled from Range Converter. Additionally, although we will be applying ICM considerations to post-flop analysis, we should note that ICM changes the game from zero-sum to non-zero-sum, which makes the optimal strategies defined by the solver a bit less reliable. So taking that into consideration, the analysis in this video should be taken with a grain of salt. However, I still think it may be useful to help us understand how ICM considerations generally influence play from a conceptual standpoint.
This card's bent.
Yeah, it's blatantly bent actually.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
Everyone's got to be super careful peeling the cards.
Yeah.
Short stutter there. Apologies.
You feeling better? Like you feel okay?
Yeah, no, I felt better after that day one.
So like I was saying, we have 3 tournaments for you. We're finishing the 25k. We have the 50k heads up, also the 100,000 pound main event starting.
Linus opens in the hijack with 10-6 suited, and Call Burns calls in the cutoff with ace-jack off. The flop comes 8-4-6 with 2 hearts, and Linus checks. As we can see, in this spot, PO Solver is much more inclined to bet, betting over 70% of its range, favoring a small 25% pot sizing. However, the Solver's c-bet strategy is mixed throughout the range, which will often mean that the EV difference between betting and checking will be close. As we can see, there is no EV difference between checking and betting small with 10-6 suited, so either play should generally be fine. But what happens when we remove ICM considerations and treat this similar to a cash game? The difference is stark. Now we see that without taking into account ICM, PO ratchets down the aggression significantly, only c-betting around 13% of the time. And this makes sense given that Burns' cold calling range in the cutoff should be quite tight and particularly concentrated around pocket pairs, which gives him a significant advantage in sets. As we can see, in both sims, Linus, although the preflop aggressor, actually is at an equity and EV disadvantage. So why the dramatic difference? Here, Linus has the chip lead with around 70 big blinds, and call is the second shortest stack with around 30 big blinds, which means Linus cannot call out of the tournament, but not vice versa. Additionally, the shortest stack of the table, Elior Scion, only has around 17 big blinds, and the pay jump between 6th place and 5th place is around 40k, which should incentivize Burns to lean towards conservative play while waiting for Scion to bust. So although PO recommends a bet here, given Linus' primary background in cash, it isn't surprising that he checks in recognition of his range disadvantage and also due to being out of position.
I'm saying Bryn's win helps a little bit as well.
I'll tell you that
I'm
so glad he chopped.
Because you would have been raging tilt today.
That would have been.
You would have just come
worse. It would
here.
have been a lot worse for him.
Yeah. I know he wanted to obviously still win.
He had like the biggest piece I think he's ever had.
Did they play for something or?
Yeah, they played for 1.1 million pounds, which in the grand scheme is like not a lot.
No.
If you're gonna chop as a chip leader, chop it at 8 when you're up 8-1, it's probably a good time to do it.
Yeah, it was a big heads up.
At that point, he doesn't have that big of a skill advantage, right?
The turn is the king of hearts, and this time Linus bets roughly 1/3 pot. In contrast, we see that PO prefers to check its marginal hand and is playing slightly more passively with its entire range. Although Linus was the preflop raiser, not only should Kyle have a number of sets in his range, he should also have a number of flushes now as well. As we can see, the betting frequencies for PO on this board create the prototypical parabola-shaped curve, where it is betting the top of its range to extract value, checking most of the middle of its range to pot control, and betting many of its hands at the bottom of the range in an effort to steal the pot.
Stretch these legs.
So with Soiza gone, Greenwood finds himself in a really tough position. He's one of the people that's going to get pressured the most by LLinusLLove because he has so much to lose. There is a short stack. Cyan pretty short. Another 20 big blind stack at the table. And with the money jumps, it's really important for Greenwood to not bust first. The shorter the other stacks at the table, the more likely you're going to make money jumps, especially if you have a nice cushioned stack like Greenwood does. We saw Linus in a similar situation. I believe it was on day 1. Re-raised with 8-7 offsuit from the big blind for this exact reason. That's why he puts pressure here with King 5 offsuit. That is the world for Luke. It's a double-sided coin though. On one side, he's gonna abuse people having the chip lead. On the other, it's important for him not to lose the chip lead because then other people can do it to him. So covering everybody is very important.
In the second hand, the action folds around to Lucas Greenwood in the small blind, and he completes with ace-9 suited. Linus raises with king 5 off, and Lucas calls. The flop comes ace-9-6, giving Lucas 2 pair, and he checks, and Linus continues with a small quarter pot bet. As we can see, Pio is playing a mixed strategy with this holding, as well as for most of its entire range. However, it is doing more checking here in Linus' shoes compared to the last hand. So why is that? Well, for one, unlike the prior hand, Lucas has a medium stack, which both can do more damage to Linus, and also has a significantly larger buffer to getting busted. However, if we rerun the sim, giving Lucas a shorter stack, we see that it only increases the c-betting frequency for Linus slightly, despite being very similar ICM-wise to the prior hand, where Pio opted to apply a lot more pressure despite being at a range disadvantage. Additionally, if we rerun this hand without ICM considerations, we see that Pio amps up the aggression, c-betting nearly the entire range. So what other factors are at play? Well, if we rerun this hand again with ICM, but this time switch the positions of the players, we see that Pio dramatically ramps up the aggression when c-betting out of position, which seems counterintuitive since typically the solver will play more passively when it is first to act with less information. It appears that the reason for this discrepancy lies in the impact of ICM's conversion of EV from chips to money, which in certain circumstances can cause EV to become significantly detached from overall equity. When Linus is in position, we see that he has a massive EV edge over Lucas, but when out of position, the EV edge shrinks considerably. However, whether in position or out of position, Linus's equity basically remains the same. So in other words, it appears that when EV and equity are not aligned, Pio will at times play more passively when in position, possibly so that it can realize its EV edge by simply closing the action to see a turn card, whereas when out of position, Pio opts to leverage ICM pressure since betting does not open up a new round of action. To attempt to prove this, we can rerun the first hand, but this time switch the positions of the players. As we can see, Pio will similarly dampen its c-betting aggression when in position versus out of position. And if we rerun the sim for hand number 2, but this time give Linus a much tighter, stronger range, which has an overall equity that correlates closer to his EV advantage, we see that in position, Pio takes a very aggressive line, not only c-betting nearly its entire range, but also using a larger sizing as well.
Small bets. He's gonna get lots of folds from Luke also because it's very likely LLinusLLove will bet on the turn in the river, exercising that pressure that we talked about. That might slow him down. He does have the emergency spade, by the way. That's pretty interesting, so he needs a spade or a king.
850.
He's gonna bet it. See, this is where it's just cool to watch somebody like a LLinusLLove play, because I just kind of expect that he's gonna check, see how he fares. His king might be good. He beats a 9. He beats some like 6-7 suited type stuff, but he just wants to put pressure.
Lucas calls, and the turn is a king of spades, giving Linus a pair and a flush draw. Lucas checks, and Linus barrels with a 60% pot bet. On this turn, we see that Pio will take Linus's line with some frequency, holding the 5 of spades, but most of the range is checking. This is likely because the small blind's pre-flop calling range should generally be tighter than the big blind's pre-flop raising range, and should also be comprised of a number of suited combos, a significant portion of which have now made a flush. As we can see, the small blind has significantly greater equity here, and nearly double the percentage of flushes compared to the big blind.
Greenwood's still going to be really comfortable with ace-9. Doesn't like the spade, of course. LLinusLLove is going to be way too aggressive in this situation to be too afraid of ace-king here, though.
Call.
Greenwood announcing call right as the timer ticks down. There is that emergency spade coming into effect. Disaster for Greenwood.
Check.
QPO.
Sorry?
QPO.
That's a rough one. Greenwood now down to 25 big blinds.
The river is the 10 of spades, putting 4 spades on the board, and both players check. We see that Pio is also checking behind in Linus' shoes with his weak flush.
Leaders in poker history, such as Fedor Holtz, Dan Coleman,
Same with that.
who else? Justin Bonwell, of course,
2.3,
recently.
like
that just go on these tears where
What
there's confidence with that. People start getting scared when you're playing like a guy like that, where everyone's like, oh, he's like a wizard, GTO, he knows every spot of every game. And when you start now, it's like, all right, well, I'm supposed to defend King 8 off in the big blind in a spot, and you're just like, you know what, I'm not gonna mess with the guy. Like that really does matter. That type of confidence and fear you instill in your opponents, it goes a long way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's kind of the Phil Ivey effect. I've never seen people get so many folds as Phil Ivey does when he raises a big blind, but we might get some action here. Luke Greenwood, excuse me, actually has a chip lead after those last few pots. Knock and carry cats out has propelled him there, of course. And Linus is just going to call with the 5s in the small blinds.
Yeah, these are interesting spots because, you know, you couldn't argue three-handed for him to make a raise with this hand, or even jam or something, depending on how many blinds it is. But it's interesting that Timothy Adams is just so short comparatively. He's on 10 blinds, and there are big pay jumps between third and second. So I think you could see Linus go either way, but maybe that was the reason. And Timothy Adams used the time bank chip here. And again, this isn't I don't think it's not a meta game. It's just kind of him thinking, do I really want to peel here with this hand versus 2 opponents? What am I going to do if I hit a little piece? And as we see, he does make middle pair. It's a tough spot. It's really one of those tricky hands to play multi-way. But I think he just thought, my hand's too good. I could flop a flush or a flush draw. And, you know, I'm going to take a flop here.
And some flop this is. I'll lead out at this. Nice thing is if he gets raised, he can still call. But he's also going to get a lot of folds from hands like ace-queen.
In this hand, the action folds around to Lucas on the button, and he min-raises with aces. Linus calls in the small blind with pocket 5s, and Timothy Adams comes along with jack 4 suited. The flop comes 6-4-3, and Linus donks with a very small bet around 18% of pot. Since this is a multi-way spot and Pio Solver only solves heads-up play, we should note that the solver solutions here will not be very reliable for this particular scenario. With that warning in mind, if we exclude Tim's hand and treat his pre-flop call as extra dead money in the pot, we see that the solver is checking 100% of its range here. And there is a pretty significant drop-off in EV between checking the fives versus betting small in Linus's shoes. However, being multi-way, Linus does get a slight equity boost when comparing the player's specific hands according to Pro Poker Tools, likely because draws tend to perform better multi-way compared to aces, which we see take a dramatic hit to equity.
You know, and this is something that he could do when he has a hand like 8-7 as well. Just like lead at it sometimes.
Yeah, and if you're Greenwood, you're like thinking, well, okay, so he's leading out. I have aces, and Timothy looks interested as well.
There's a lot of tips in the middle. I mean, if Adams were to move all in, he'd just double up even if everybody folds. So if he thinks there's a big chance that Linus is messing about here.
I think he's going to go with it. I mean, he's just so short. He hits a pair, and if you see Linus lead with fives, now this is a spot where he could be leading 7-8 or there are some draws, some spades. Timothy doesn't have a spade. He may just say, you know what, I'm going to go with it. But he does flat call, and this is a bit tricky of a spot for Greenwood. All of a sudden, you do have aces, but that board going to connect with. You got a raise, a bet, and a call, and he's trying to think, how do I proceed? He's not so worried about Timothy, right? Like if he somehow were to double up him or gets in a weird spot, but he's got to be very concerned with Linus's stack here and what's going on. What do you do if you're Greenwood in this spot? I mean, I'd imagine you're going to find a raise, but it could go on either side here. Obviously can't fold, and he is ahead, so I mean, that's not even a consideration. You have aces on a low board, but...
Yeah, it's really tricky, right? Because if Adams had, let's say he had the nuts, right? The straight, or he would probably be doing the same. He's going to raise.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of comes down to what does he expect Linus to do. If Linus somehow had a set of fours, a set of threes, a set of sixes, would he lead out with this scenario? Mm-hmm. You have Adams, who's so short and may just jam. You expecting probably a c-bet from Greenwood. So it does call. And Timothy going to find a way to get out of here.
What's important there is that even if Timothy Adams would have gone all in, Greenwood would not have the option. So the max that LLinusLLove would have to pay there is like 500 more, and he does hit the straight on the turn.
What a card too! Just in case you want to worry about somehow your opponent is raising with big 2 overs and a flush draw, you get the clean of the clean. You got to know that Greenwood just doesn't have 5-7 in this spot. First of all, you block 2 5s, so I mean, it's just the money of money cards.
So Tim calls, Lucas raises to 1.5 million, Linus calls, and Tim folds, leaving us heads up. The turn brings a 2 of clubs, completing Linus' straight, and he checks. We see on this card, Peel will donk with some frequency, primarily because the small blind should have a number of sets here, and Peel also adds in some flush and straight draw bluffs to balance out its range. However, most of the range, including most fives that contain a spade blocker, are checking.
He's so tricky too. Like I've seen him. He has so many different ways of playing his hands, and this is going to be an interesting spot for Greenwood too. Can't love that card. He doesn't have a spade in his hand. He could put Linus on a flush draw. Players have history. I don't know here. This is not. You see the 0% for aces on the turn. So this hand is locked up for Linus. Barring a 5 would come and they would be chopping.
There's not that many 5 combinations that Greenwood's going to be up against, because Linus knows Greenwood's the chip leader. Like, what am I going to do here? Call a small blind with 6-5 suited? That just doesn't happen. So
right.
Greenwood's still going to be very comfortable. And we see him firing out 1.5 million here.
That's a great point. What fives is he flatting, especially when Tim Adams has that jam stack? Like is he even going to call ace-5? He blocks ace-5, but he's not calling king-5 suited. He's not calling 5-6 suited in the scenario. So it's kind of
pocket fives or
disgusting,
no fives.
Right? Yeah, that's it.
And then you just go back to the point. Well, this is Linus. So if it's hard for him to have the nuts here on this board, and what else? Like. Right. 6-4, like all that stuff is just not there. So Greenwood has to be incredibly comfortable in his hand. He gets put all in. Needs a count. I understand the frustration.
Yeah, it's also with him having no spade really does matter here, because he's just thinking what hand, like, could he have a hand like 7-8 suited, but what do you call that pre-flop? Does he have king jack suited, king queen suited? And the sick part is that Linus is so in tune to ranges as well, and this, he knows that by shoving here, that's literally what he's repping, is 2-5. So
Lucas repeats his bet and Linus shoves. As we can see, Pew does advise to raise the 5s, but interestingly it opts for a smaller 3x sizing, and shoving actually produces the least EV among his options, mostly because Luke should have a greater percentage of 5s here, given Linus's tight small blind calling range. However, in a game without ICM, we see that Pew does shove with some frequency with the 5s, and the shove produces greater EV than checking. So what are the ICM implications here? Well, in this scenario, unlike the last two hands, Linus has the shorter stack between the two players, and therefore Lucas has the ability to bust him from the tournament, but not vice versa. Additionally, the third player in the equation, Timothy Adams, has less than 10 big blinds, and the pay jump between third and second place is approximately 160k pounds, which should somewhat deter the small blind from wanting to play for stacks, even with a very strong hand.
7s and 8s and stuff pretty often too, and he could play that the same. Lead the flop, maybe hope Adams shoves, gets Greenwood out the way, and then you raise, and they're obviously going to stick around for one time. So on the turn, you're pretty comfortable. Like, how many 5s does this guy have, right? Like, we just discussed that.
Yeah.
Pretty much only pocket 5s. And then...
I think he may ultimately make the call. I think because that's a good point. What does he do with 7s and 8s and 9s and such? He does call.
Makes the call, pocket 5s. He's going to be disgusted.
Yeah,
Indeed.
Right.
And after a long tank, Lucas calls, which we see is consistent with the solver strategy, as Lucas is high up in his distribution, and there are a number of draws that Linus potentially could have taken this line with.
On the button, he's thinking, not much,
All in.
and he actually has a really nice hand to do
Yeah.
it with. It's just,
One.
Timothy's interesting. Okay, well, so,
1.
I mean, this is one that's just,
50 back.
Pasha,
there's
it
a
shows you,
limit.
though, it shows you, though, like, it's like, you know, it'd be more interesting to see ace 9 or 10 or ace 8, but I just think, yeah, this particular one is just basically the nuts.
There's a limit to what you can fold, for sure. I mean, he's still going to be ahead
Right.
a ginormous amount of times.
So Linus, now with the commanding chip lead, shoves his ace-5 off on the button against both of Timothy's and Lucas's extremely short stacks. The folks at Range Converter were kind enough to hook us up with GTO preflop ranges customized for these specific stacks and taking into account ICM. And as we can see, the solver recommends shoving 100% of the button's range in Linus's shoes. Yes, even all the way down to 3 deuce off. Since both of the short stacks have less than 10 big blinds, and with the 160k pay jump, both Lucas and Tim should be playing extremely tight calling ranges, which allows the button to apply max pressure, as each of the short stacks will be inclined to sit tight, hoping for the other to bust. As we can see, with Tim calling in the small blind, the solver will only overcall in the big blind with jacks plus.
He referenced, he hit a 1-outer, though, on the bubble, essentially. 6s to 10s, and he turned to 6, and 6 was dead.
Wow, that's a 5 for
there's a
Linus. This
5.
is really another rough situation. I mean, at least he's top 3 now, but we've seen Timothy Adams at the worst of it, but he's not out yet.
Yeah.
3 kings left.
Jack or queen makes it extra interesting. He doesn't have backdoor flush draw. But you see, this is the exact reason why putting the chipset at work. You even want to see a count. Like, there's a scenario, let's say Greenwood had only 3 blinds, you know, maybe you probably would fold. There is a cutoff where he's going to risk himself, so.
Yeah. All right, now an ace good too.
Yeah, not the worst turn. Picks up additional outs. Linus is thinking. Is it going to be heads up, or is it going to be a little more work? And that is it. I think that's an understatement. You're capable of doing some stuff. Yeah, I mean, probably shoving 99.9, only if you maybe had to use the restroom. Even then, he'd probably shove and go. I just don't see him folding any hand there.
Yeah, this is 6 big blinds deep.
Okay. I have a
Jack high.
Oh, I was.
Oh, and dominated.
Oh,
Just
no.
the Linus show.
So Lucas decides to face his inevitable demise head on and shoves with 10-7 suited and Linus calls, both of which are relatively standard plays. As we can see, with less than 6 big blinds and given the full big blind ante, Lucas should be shoving quite wide here with over 80% of his range, which in turn forces the big blind to call wide as well, even with Jack 7 off.
Does have spades. This is, yeah, anything can happen.
All right.
Yeah,
Interesting.
good flop for Greenwood. Picks up additional outs. There's Dan Smith interested on the sideline, taking a look. Fresh off his 3rd place in the £1 million Triton event, plus 50,000 for charity. That is number 4 on the all-time money list now, Dan Smith.
Needs a 10 or a 9. Or it's lights out. 3-handed could be over in just 2 hands.
Shout out to Joe Gyron there, taking photos on the rail. He's just everywhere. He was there till 4 a.m. last night, and that's going to do it.
Doesn't do it.
So I thought these hands were interesting in part because Linus's play generally appeared to deviate a bit more from the solver strategies compared to past hands we've reviewed of him, which did not have ICM implications. This can be expected since Linus is primarily a cash game player, and Linus may have also been incorporating some exploitative plays as well by doing some kind of internal node locking in his CPU. In terms of what we can take away from this, well, we saw that when ICM is in play, larger stacks should generally be looking to apply pressure to smaller stacks, but with some limits, as we saw with Pio playing a bit more timidly when equity and EV were not aligned. And the smaller stacks should generally be playing tighter as they seek to outlast other short stacks and ladder up the pay scale. Of course, it's not possible to calculate ICM real time, but I think this knowledge can be useful to keep in mind, at least in an abstract way, to tilt our frequencies towards aggression or passivity for borderline decisions depending on the circumstances. So that's the video for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay balanced.